do you know about Hyvä already then?
I only really know what I saw on the launch party, which was fun. I didn't drink enough, but it was still fun.
Yeah.
And I wish it could have been in person. I think it would have been way more fun. But you know, it's light. And you know, one of the things that really interested me out of the launch party was some of the topics around why did they change. You know, like they started with Vue Storefront and they found it very complicated. And so then they said, oh, let's use Willem's theme, and suddenly within a week or two they had a working website. You know, me, I guess myself as a let's just see, agency leader or whatever my title is now, I'm interested in that because I feel like in the last, well, since Magento 2 came out, but certainly in the last couple of years, Magento, it feels heavier and it's bloated and it's harder and people are complaining, and you know, so this seems very fresh and exciting, and that's the number one thing. You know, I had a really good conversation with Vinay, and Vinay was excited about it, and
well,
so
and I like. And I like the part also that Vinay mentioned somewhere on Twitter, or maybe repeatedly as well, that this was the first time he got excited about something in Magento. So that's proving a point as well, I guess. But yeah, so to me, I find it interesting that indeed Internet, so the creators behind Hyvä, first tried out Vue Storefront, and I believe actually before that they tried out Deity as well. So another PWA provider, as I call them, because they basically just supply you with part of the stack, and then on top of it you can build your own PWA. But for me, the interesting part is that they set out to well replace that current front end that we basically got to hate. All of the knockouts require too much JavaScript, too much complexity, and more importantly, it's also really hard to optimize well. And while actually the front end world just passed on, or not passed on, but moved on with a focus upon modern day practices to improve the Lighthouse score, to improve the mobile experience, etc. Nothing changed within Magento. So when they started with Deity, I think they were promised also by the people of Deity all of these perfect options to do something better with the front end, with one caveat, I personally believe, which is Deity is based upon React, is using also a really React-based stack with Apollo client, or at least in that past, I believe that was part of the story. And their architecture was basically nothing alike Magento. And because of that, actually, if you dive into Deity, well, back then, but still nowadays, you really need to get and to understand the whole architecture of a React app communicating with some kind of Node middleware layer, where Magento is just part of all of the microservices in that backend. And I think back then, a lot of people were promised that it would be awesome, but also easy. And maybe it's still awesome, but it's definitely not easy.
yeah.
So then actually they started with Vue Storefront, and they got led into that same promise. But to my personal feeling, as in it's kind of like the same architecture, and it's offering a middleware layer where just Magento is just one of those backend services that you would connect to. But now not based upon React, but based upon Vue. So to make it successful, you really need to be a good Vue developer, and etc. And personally, I got started with React, I think now about three and a half years ago or so. Slowly got started with it, doing side projects with it. And only about half a year later or 1 year later, I slowly began to say that I was maybe good at React. And that's, I think, the difficulty for a lot of Magento agencies, if they are not being lured, but maybe being promised like an easy kickstart with some kind of PWA technology. They think like, oh, but then we're going to do the first project, and then we're going to make a couple of mistakes. And then with the second project, it's going to run better. And then with the third project, it's going to be more successful. But before doing that first project, you still first need to become a Vue developer or a React developer. Well, and that's basically where Willem stood up and he said, like, well, we could become React developers, we could become Vue developers, but why? We could also just recreate the front end in a better way based upon that same stack with Magento. So the XML layout and the PHTML templates and a lot of stuff in there is still the same. It's just that the technology that is loaded into the browser, CSS and JavaScript, that's just completely wiped out and rebuilt for something better, which is where the performance comes from. But then because of that, actually, it's a tiny little layer that the front-end development team needs to know about. And I maybe say it a little bit without respect. I call it tiny, but switching to Tailwind and Alpine is learning a totally new way of dealing with things. So there's a learning curve, and definitely there's the kickstart of becoming first a junior, but then slowly you need to become a senior as well into it. But I think in general that promise suddenly was making more sense to a lot of developers. So that's long story short, like my current opinion a little bit of like how I see it, how they got started with Hyvä in the first place and where they see the benefit of it. However, I think there's also counter side as well. The release party of Hyvä was nice to see so many different friends from the Magento community get excited about something within the scope of Magento, and I think that's showing something, and that's well worth Hyvä already. However, I also caught that negative scent about that people were not too happy with Vue Storefront.
Yeah, I got that out of there too.
Yeah, and that made me
I don't
think.
know, but I definitely got the sense that there was an unhappiness, and I think it's really directed from Willem and some of their experiences around those few people that have done it.
Yeah.
So.
And it's kind of logical that as soon as they become negative about something and they simply want to be honest and open about their own personal opinion, that they're going to share that. However, now that Hyvä is kind of like on the rise, suddenly a lot of agencies simply decide upon like, oh, but then PWA Studio is shit, and then basically all of those other alternative front ends are not good enough. But I still remember actually the days where I've given, for instance, a PWA Studio training to an experienced team of React developers. They simply just understood everything I told them about PWA Studio. For them, it was not hard. For them, it was kind of natural the way that the architecture was built up. Hooks were being implemented. The stuff they needed to do themselves because it was not done for them. And then I started to talk about theme inheritance, and they started to laugh like, hey, but we don't want to have theming. That's what we do anyway with a React application. We build our own stuff.
I think we should kind of split this into three areas. Like one would be the technical side, which, I think we don't want to go too technical here. And the next one would be sort of the agency side and how an agency approaches this. And then I think the third area that the client is very interested in something, we should talk about that. So, I guess I'm not super interested in talking in depth about the technical bits of this. And I think
that's so disappointing. No, go ahead.
Your blog post actually gives I'll post a blog post as part of when we publish this video, but I think your blog post goes through a lot of it very in depth, not in depth, but it does give a really good, it gives a good summary of what we should expect as a developer and from a technical side. And, for me, it was a really good perspective on what a developer should be looking at. And then as you jump from, if I change my hat to the agency side, like, oh, okay, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I can see why if you're a React developer trying to do Hyvä,
Hyva.
that again, that might be confusing because then you do have to know all the different functions that a typical Magento theme would offer. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, and then that's basically maybe also the thing. So for developers, I think actually a lot of times the developers out there that are to be heard, so that are mouthy, they actually are mouthy in multiple ways. So first of all, you hear them speak out loud about certain things, but they also easily share their own personal opinion, which makes it always harder for maybe other developers to point out like, okay, but I disagree or I agree with a certain vision there. And I think actually with the Magento ecosystem, it's now a fact that actually Adobe is going to go for the PWA Studio route. It's also a fact that a lot of Magento developers love Hyvä as well. And it's also a fact for me that actually there's a lot of agencies that don't want to go the Adobe way, but don't want to go either the Hyvä way, but they want to go their own way with the front ending. So instead of talking about one front end, the reality is going to be in the upcoming 5 years that there's going to be multiple front ends. For me, that's challenging already because as soon as I would receive somebody who's interested in a front-end developer training, my next question would be, but which one? Which front-end do you want to use? And if there's zero knowledge, then it's also kind of more difficult to find out what kind of technology would fit that person best. And that would be on a per developer basis. But then if we are looking at it from an agency point of view, then, well, to my personal understanding, it's either the commercial part that you need to deal with or still the developer part, but then it's not one single developer, but it's just a bunch of developers. So how to make sure that you're adopting that specific technology that is actually the best for your development team. If they're going to hate it, you're not going to be productive. If they are going to love it, but they're not going to be really productive into it, it's not going to work out either. And somehow you need to find out all of that beforehand. And that's kind of the challenging thing, I think, for the upcoming years.
Yeah. And I think too, like, what is your goal as an agency? Is your goal as an agency to have something like Vue Storefront that you could also bolt on to BigCommerce? You know, I think that if you have a mixture of business and there is a solution that if Vue is the answer, that and you have a team of Vue developers and you can be developing storefronts on BigCommerce or Magento, that makes a lot of sense to kind of centralize in that solution. I'm a little, I think the only hesitation I have on Vue Storefront is then you're putting your sort of, unless you did it like just did it on your own, you're kind of putting it with them. Like it's not a sort of independent thing. It's kind of like even Hyva. I would like to talk about some of the commercial bits of it. Like I feel like Hyvä should be an open source. It would be a much more successful project if it was open source. But then how does how do they make money on that part of it?
Well, and money is one part, but it's also basically how they find the time to make sure that it's moved from this early stage where a lot of features are working, but it's not yet feature complete, as in the old front end, which makes a couple of people say, but then Hyvä is not stable enough. But there's also basically the calculation that you need to make. If Magento, its traditional front end, is 100% feature complete. However, with every customization, it's going to cost you twice. While with Hyvä, it's going to cost you half, but it's not feature complete yet. It's just depending upon what kind of project you're running, which one is going to be more profitable. And I think the aim for Hyvä is just to take over. That's what they dream of, but you can't do that unless you have some financial guarantee. So that's actually still what's happening, I think, internally. But yeah, so back to your point upon Vue Storefront. yeah, the login is something actually that makes me laugh a little bit, because what is the current login with Magento to the traditional front end? Well, there's a login with an open source project called Knockout. There's a login with an open source project, Require. And there's so many different projects actually involved with Magento, because Magento is not just all of the code written by Magento, but it's the combination of hundreds of open source projects. And the challenge is actually not that much who owns that code, because with Vue Storefront, it's open source. So that's not really the difficulty. The more challenging question would be how well maintained is that code?
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to honestly say that Vue Storefront is actually so eager to still fulfill their own goals, to make sure that their own community is happy. So they're really active.
Yeah.
While I honestly don't know about the activity of the Knockout project.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not familiar with the Knockout one. Is that one you started?
No. So that's actually part of the traditional front end, as in
gotcha.
the old
sorry.
Luma
Yeah.
theme.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
knockout JavaScript. But yeah, so basically there's so many different open source projects already making up Magento, and often we don't realize it. And it's just now that we make somebody else responsible for maintaining that front end.
Mm-hmm.
While Magento has not been really maintaining it for 5 years anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So as I see it, we've been in a lock-in already. We've been in a lockdown, a Corona lockdown kind of, but then a Magento lockdown for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's not that Magento was forcing it upon us, but it was simply us not being clever enough to break out of it.
Yeah.
And at least Deity and Vue Storefront, they paved the way. And now Hyvä is just doing it in a different style that seems to be kind of like a winning game for a lot of agencies, but not everyone. And that's just, well, proving that the lockdown is over.
Yeah, I think the reality too is, a couple of years ago, or thank God it's not 2020, right? Derek, I went to, I did a business trip to Belgium and with Adobe, and we met with a client who we did some training for, and their site was loading in like 8 seconds. And somehow they found that acceptable. And then I started doing some analysis at the time, and your typical Magento site loads in 4 seconds, which is still not acceptable, right?
Yeah. So I find it also hard a little bit, like how to compare things, right? So a slow loading time definitely is bad for the user experience.
And the point is that I feel like at some point, us in the Magento community started to accept some of these things as we're not going to go much faster because I don't know what it doesn't matter we're just, okay, this big, huge company, and I'm not going to name any names, is working for this big age agency and their load time is 8 seconds. Can we improve on that? Yes, of course we can improve on it. The PWA Studio comes out and your load time is 1 second or 2 seconds out of the box or something. Well, why shouldn't Magento, why shouldn't just a regular theme? I think you're right. 5 years of stagnation has led us to having the regular theme load in 4 or 5 seconds or whatever that is. Well, I think the Hyvä thing that it was exciting for me is that they're showing less than 1 second load times, which I think is super exciting.
Well, that's still the technical part, right? But I personally also see that there's kind of like a philosophical or how do you say that? Well, basically, if you study what's going on with the Magento community, it's kind of interesting that we've been in that situation for 5 years, and then only after 5 years, some smart Dutch guy stands up and says, like, I'm going to do it differently. And to me, it's kind of showing also that still too many people refer to Magento as being the solution provider for everything. While the reality is that once I started to dive into Magento 2, I started to read myself into all of that related technology. But once I learned something about Composer, for instance, and I went back to Magento, then I thought like, hey, but am I not understanding it properly, or is Magento doing it differently than I would do that? And slowly, while diving into all of that technology, well, to the very least, I learned that Magento developers are people too, and people make mistakes. However, because they are Magento developers, suddenly they need to come up with the most ideal and most perfect solution. While the reality is that we've learned already for the last 5 years that's not the case. People within Magento make architectural decisions, and some of them are awesome, but some of them are maybe less wise. And then we bluntly just copy all of that and say like, okay, but because it's Magento, then it's true. While the whole purpose of open source is just to collaborate and work together to improve it, and be critical as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, the critical part, I think, is something that we've sort of been lulled into a sense of complacency on what we have, and the reality of that is that people are flocking to Shopify and some of these other SaaS-based platforms.
Yeah, well, while the reality is as well that the inner core of Magento is just so full of opportunities still. There's so many good things in the architecture as well. However, we need to be critical about what are the good parts and what are the bad parts. And the funny thing is, actually, I've been talking to this about this with Magento people itself as well, and they all confirm that same picture. They don't want Magento to be the perfect CMS, because it's not about building a CMS, it's about e-commerce. They don't want the inventory system to replace all of those ERP systems out there. No, they simply want to have a flexible system that could be there to be implemented in numerous sites, but there's still a reason why people or larger e-commerce clients have ERP systems as well. They're not looking for replacing all of that, even though sometimes you get that impression by looking at the roadmap, etc. But the real goal is just to make sure that they do e-commerce as well as they can, while relying upon a community to keep them sharp and to direct them also in certain direction that is needed.
Right.
And then back to the front end bit, I find it almost funny that only 5 years later, after that initial release of Magento 2.0, after so many people left Magento or were looking at PWA solutions or simply were negative about Magento altogether, that they came up with an alternative themselves. So what happened in between? Like, so that's the thing I find funny to conclude. Like, okay, it's telling me also something about how a community sometimes works. That sometimes it's not inventive enough to come up with a clean solution, or maybe it did because, well, currently we have Hyvä and we have a wonderful community coming up with exciting things. But yeah, so that's kind of like the anthropological approach of how I see things as well.
Yeah, and I'll speak from the agency side, because I feel like as an agency person that I'm dealing with both sides, right? I'm dealing with what the client wants and the costs of what you can deliver to the client, and then I think from a sales side, you're dealing with, because it costs this and because there's some complexity, you have to say no to the client, right? Which no salesperson wants to do that. From the developer side, you have all these mixed messages and complexity and different technologies that the developer should learn to be able to execute on something. So as an agency, you're getting pulled in all sort of different ways that it would be good if somebody just, one of the easiest things about Magento when it first came out is it was just a monolith and you just did it this way, and there wasn't a lot of choices, right? And there's even more choices, which is good and bad. And I think one thing Vinay has said too is that he it is getting, as it gets more complex, less people are going to be interested in it.
Yeah. Well, and that's maybe referring to the Magento core architecture. So things like MSI are both awesome, but also really difficult. And I actually read up a Slack thread this morning where a lot of people were just also discussing like that maybe one of the good things of Magento currently is that you could remove MSI as well using hacky things, which is maybe again proving something also. However, I do see people get enthusiastic about MSI as well. And basically the reason to have this little call together was to discuss the front end. And the interesting thing again for me as well is that again also with that front ending, some people love Hyvä and some other people are critical, just like with React and just like with everything else. And Magento is no longer that monolith. So that's kind of like the reality, first of all, that everyone needs to realize, not only developers, but also agencies and also the client. And it doesn't mean that the era of Magento is over. It just simply means that we need to make certain choices more careful. And the difficulty there is for a developer, it should boil down to what kind of technology are you good at? So if you are bad at creating React code, but you understand Hyvä, well, then go that way. But if you've played around with React already, and basically you want to get rid of that XML layout of the traditional front end, then React is the way to go for. So I personally see that developers should follow their guts or their heart, or well, it's more a personal choice. For an agency, it's more difficult choice because you already have those developers, and what you need to find out is basically the sum of all of your developers, and see like to which direction all of those developers together as a whole are leaning into. Are they leaning into Vue or React or Hyvä? What is getting them excited? Because if you're trying to push it in an opposite direction of what they actually want, it's not going to work out.
Yeah, exactly.
But then more difficult if, again, they're going to choose a direction that they find awesome, but they're not good at it, then it's also not going to work out because, well, then you're wasting time and money of the client. And that's, I think, like the most difficult part. All of those choices need to boil down to economics, so money needs to be made. And that's also for the client the most frustrating part, that if you go to one agency in the near future, that agency will say, oh, but we use Hyvä and the performance is guaranteed. And then you go to another agency and they say like, well, we're using PWA Studio and the Lighthouse score there is much better than Hyvä. And then you go to the third one and they say like, well, Vue Storefront is more independent, so you don't have a lock-in with Magento. And what should you choose? I don't know. I honestly don't know where that's going to lead to. But theoretically, technology, because there's more technology around, it should be less leading the decision.
Yeah, and I think, look, each of the agencies is going to make their choice, and it probably will be some kind of a hybrid between using a wired-in theme like Hyvä or using Vue Storefront or PWA Studio. That's probably where it's going to be at. You know, they're going to make a decision internally on which way to go, or they might have a big enough organization where they have Vue developers and they have some React developers. But I think from the client side, then the hard part is you know, figuring out is the cost of this and then the long-term maintenance of it, and then comparing that to some other SaaS platform. And I think if you look at Magento in the sense of just, hey, I'm going to turn it on, just like you turn on a SaaS type of thing, it is no more complicated or less complicated than it would be just turning on Shopify. The hard part is that you can do whatever you want to it. And as soon as you tell somebody, yeah, of course you can do that, but it's going to cost this much money, they're like, what? No, I want to do it though. And I don't want it to cost any money.
Yeah. Yeah, so the
So
difficulty is always like technology is maybe open source and it's all available without a price, but there's actually a huge price in there, and that's the customization bit. But I think actually that most of the clients out there looking for a project in reality don't know about the technology at all. So instead of actually selling the technology, it would much more be like to sell the outcome. And the outcome for a client is obviously to have a fast shop. And simply put, I don't believe when Hyvä people are saying that you can't build a fast shop with Vue Storefront, or I don't believe when the people of Vue Storefront are saying the same thing about the alternatives. All of those technologies that are nowadays there are leading into faster front ends anyway.
yeah.
It's just that the technology and the agency are tightly connected, and that's where the current diversity comes from in the current community as well. So yeah, different people, different needs.
Yeah, and I think the reality of it is that the client is going to care about the amount of time it takes to build it, the speed of the site when it's done, and how much it costs to maintain over time. And then finally, what are the features that are there without having to do anything? And then what features can I make at some reasonable price? So, I mean,
Yeah,
those are really good indicators of what, as a salesperson, that I'm going to tell the client. And I think then it's up to the agency to kind of spell that out. So, Magento is going to cost this much to maintain. The less you do to it, the cheaper it is going to be to run it. Like if you just get Magento out of the box, and
yeah,
honestly, if you attach something like PWA Studio or Vue Storefront, right, you're essentially headless, and once Magento changes, and if you don't add a bunch of modules, you are almost like a SaaS platform.
yeah,
Like you
yeah.
could run Magento in the back without ever having to touch it. Just do the standard upgrades and run your front end the way you'd like to run it.
Yeah, and actually that's still opportunity of headless. So there's agencies out there that want to specialize in Magento, but others are just open-minded more that they also want to take in other competitors of Magento. But I think that there's so much change, and that therefore a lot of people in the ecosystem of Magento are confused, like where should we go to next and what's going to happen. But I was just reminded of reminding myself that actually in the past we had that same point where Magento 2 was introduced and we needed to migrate to Magento 2. But then with a stack that is much more complex, with a front end that is still dead slow and outdated, and there's so many things wrong with it. We still managed to do all of those different projects. We still managed to sell all of it to the clients as well. So apparently we can still do that with new upcoming front ends as well. That's
that's
funny
reality.
thought I had. That's the reality. Yeah.
Yep, and we did launch a project. I remember right when Magento 2.0 came out. I'm thinking it was November of 2015 when it was launched officially.
Yeah.
And I think we had a project live by like January.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was very difficult. There was so many bugs, and
Yeah.
anyways, it was an interesting time. But yeah, you're exactly right. We definitely looked at it as this is bigger, better, faster, more features. And it certainly was no more features. It certainly was bigger.
Yeah.
Faster is coming, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and overall, I simply think that the challenge of the upcoming time is not going to be how good a certain technology is like, or which PWA is going to win the battle. I think they're all going to win. So the more difficult thing is for each developer, for each agency, but also for each client, is to make the right choice in the right way.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's the bottom line is that it's not going to be easy, but definitely it's going to be offering more opportunities than before. because basically all of that wonderful technology is now at our disposal, which is a great thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess regardless of whether Hyvä is better than Vue Storefront or PWA Studio, it has sparked some excitement in the community, and we're talking about it now. And I would suspect that we're going to see more people talking about it. I think if we were to summarize the technical side, I thought that, again, your blog post summarized it very well. Get a React developer to do your React work. Don't try to just instantly convert a Magento front end developer to React. And I can tell you that I've made that exact mistake. We've just put people on those projects saying, it's just JavaScript, just do it, without actually listening to it. I think that those type of things from a technical side are a great place to start and a great place to do it. I think the challenge is making sure that, I guess if you're going to hire, if you're going to have some developers that are specifically doing something, then it's harder to get them to, at some point, if they're only React and you only have one project, they're going to be redundant.
Yeah, exactly. And that's I think one of the points that everyone, so the technology stack is just growing, and it's not just Magento or React or Vue, but it's also Elasticsearch. It's also all of those other microservices that are currently being adopted by Magento. Put together, you can't be a real good full stack developer because the stack is too full. So there's the stack is too large to have that knowledge and to be good at everything. So sometimes I'm getting an email of people promoting their services because they're good at everything. So they're a specialist at all. But then they're not a
specialist at nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
they're
a generalist, and that's the main point here.
Yeah, and then that brings up a whole nother topic but I know we're out of time today, but I think that it does lend to the whole idea of how do you get somebody into Magento so they feel comfortable. And I think from a technology side and talking to a client, you can't make it overly complicated. And I think some of the ways people are approaching this are wrong right now to get people into Magento. It's sometimes you're explaining too much. So I think that there has to be a different approach, and there has to be a different approach even from the Vue Storefront and PWA side. There has to be an approach of having some buy-in from Adobe, and for us, I think from an agency side, I don't see a lot of PWA stuff happening yet. I know that there's JH and there's some agencies that are doing PWA Studio. But honestly, I don't see it I don't see hundreds of stores going out there getting launched every day when that's what should be happening.
Well, and then the question I still have is it still not happening because people don't get PWA, or is it still not happening because simply nobody was actually waiting for PWA? They were waiting for something like Hyvä. But likewise, a lot of people were on Magento 1 waiting for Magento 2 to improve in a certain way. And then it didn't happen because they were simply waiting for the wrong Magento 2 version. So Magento 2 is a different approach, a different technology, different way of strategy of dealing with things. And that's something we need to accept. So likewise, PWA, I personally believe that PWA Studio and Vue Storefront are more than ready. It's just the question, are you expecting full features of everything that was there in the past with Magento, making Magento so complex? Or are you just waiting for those core features that are well supported, just to have an easier platform to build your own features in an easier way, lowering the barrier of new functionality? So it's just a question, what are we waiting for? And now at least I see also the benefit of Hyvä, that we got this alternative which is resembling Magento so much. but now done properly in a modern day web environment with Tailwind, CSS, and Alpine JS, so that at least the performance is good already out of the box. But it doesn't mean that PWA is not going to happen. It's just that PWA is not going to happen for everyone.
Right, exactly. Well, good. It was great talking today. I did have a couple of questions from our team they wanted to ask you. One question from Madeline Anderson was, when are you moving to Minnesota?
Yeah, well, currently we have this situation with a pandemic happening all over the world. So I think that's maybe just postponing this question for next year or so.
And just my comment is we had 2 weeks of minus 20 Celsius straight without ever going above minus 10 Celsius. And
yeah,
it seems like a great place to live in January.
But still, you think I think you had still electricity, right? So in Texas,
yes, we are very accustomed to very hot and very cold.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We had another question from our Latin team, and they want to know if you like tacos.
I do.
Good. We've covered all the important points in our webinar today, and I'm super excited. All right. So anything that you wanted to say about Yireo?
Yireo.
Yes, that's what I said.
Sorry, say it
Yireo.
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 Yeah.
You want to get a plug for yourself?
No, not really. Except for maybe if people are interested in reading that blog, it's showing basically what I'm personally busy with. So I'm personally seeing myself as a happy developer, guiding people also in the relevant technology. And personally, I'm just happy to dive into Hyvä, but I'm also happy to dive into PWA Studio and Vue Storefront. So come talk to me if you also want to debate more all about this, because the more discussions we have about this, the more healthy the Magento community will get. That's
I can't agree with you more about that. I think that some reinvigoration into the community. This is a great time to start. Soon we'll be able to travel, and soon we'll be able to have our in-person conferences, and hopefully Mage Unconf happens this year. I don't know if it's going to, but
Mage Unconf Minnesota.
No, is it already canceled from Germany? It's usually in like September or October, right? Or November.
Yeah, but I don't know about whether something is going to happen there.
We can edit this out, and maybe we'll just do a short spot that said yes or no later.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. But I can maybe also still promote that Reacticon is going to happen for the 4th time. And it's definitely not going to be in a physical spot, though. So it's going to be online. Just like the previous time, free attendance to anyone, and it's going to be focused upon all of this front-end stuff and more.
Wow,
the proper.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And the proper pronunciation of Hyvä or
Hyva
or
Hyvä.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my react to that is that I'm viewing that at a new angle now, and I'm excited for Reacticon.
Dropping the microphone. Perfect ending.
All right, Jisse, thank you. Jisse, sorry. Jisse.
Yeah, thank you, Brent.
Yes, good
for having me.
And we'll do this again. We have so many more topics now that I've thought about as we're talking here. And again, I'll post the link to your blog post on when we'll have some notes or something, and we'll link it directly to there. And I feel like everybody should read it. And it was a great summary of those 3 technologies.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Bye.
And thanks for having me. See you.
You're very welcome.